In Spokane County, Washington, 3 women are brutally murdered.
All 3 of the victims were found near the river.
With a possible serial killer on the loose, police are extra vigilant.
They were meticulous in collecting every bit of evidence they could, even what they couldn't imagine might be helpful later on, years later.
One victim had not made it easy for her attacker.
She obviously battled well enough to collect DNA under her fingernails of skin from him, doing it to collect enough skin so that would be still there 20 years later.
Eventually, detectives uncover a suspect. There's a problem, though. Evidence suggests that the serial killer is a man, but their suspect is a woman.
You want me to take my pants off and show you?
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Donna Perry as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake?
If you kill somebody, you're going to get caught.
Spokane, Washington is a city that looks like it just has it all. It's nestled along a river. It's edged by mountains and forests. It even has a rushing waterfall running through the center of town. It's just lovely.
In the 1980s, recession hit this pretty town with an industrial past. The decline in manufacturing led to pay cuts, job losses, and for some, real grinding poverty. It was against this backdrop that grim discoveries were made on the riverside.
My name is Jim Hansen. I'm a retired detective from Spokane County Sheriff's Department. In 1990, I was one of the detectives involved in the investigation of 3 prostitutes that were killed in Spokane County and City. This is primarily the area where a lot of the girls work. We don't know exactly where any of the 3 girls were picked up. We know the areas that they worked. In the evening, it was dimly lit. You know, there were a number of taverns, but primarily the businesses were closed and the girls were just, you know, walking the sidewalks.
So who were these women? All 3 of the women had worked as prostitutes along East Sprague Avenue in Spokane. They were friends, they'd known each other, they worked the same area, town. They all had families who loved them. Some of them had actually lived together in an old motel not far from where they worked.
Over the decade of the 80s, there were a number of different prostitute killings. And then in 1990, within about a 5-month period, we had 3 that were definitely linked together. All 3 of the homicides were brutal in the fact that a gun was used. All 3 of the victims were found near the river. So there were a number of facts that binded these 3 together.
Yolanda Sapp was 26. Yolanda had been shot 3 times in the chest. Her body was found nude and sprawled over an embankment just for the whole world to see. The bracelets and the necklace that she was known to have worn were gone.
That was on February 22nd, 1990.
A month later, in March of 1990, Nikki Lowe, she was 34 years old. Her body was found under the Green Street Bridge. She was partially nude. She died of a single gunshot wound to the chest.
Nikki Lowe's crime scene provided the first clues.
Missing were her tennis shoes and her red wallet, but those items were later found by a resident in the area. They were found in a dumpster. And some of that evidence that was found in that dumpster would later wind up leading to the killer.
Then came the third shocking murder of a vulnerable East Sprague Avenue sex worker in just 4 months. 14 years later, a detective fresh to the investigation would revisit the events of that night.
I am Jim Dressbeck, a retired detective with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. In 2004, I took over cases for another retired detective, and one of those cases was the Kathy Brisboe case.
Kathy Brisboe was 38. She was a mother and a grandmother. Her body was found on the west side of the Spokane River in Spokane Valley.
So we're at generally in the area of Trenton Pines, right along the banks of the Spokane River, and this is where Kathy Brisboe's body was eventually recovered. And we believe that she was brought here, probably drove her in here. And I think basically they came here to do the sex act, whatever that was. And that either before, during, or after, she must have had some sort of event that caused her enough concern that she probably tried to get away from him. They got into a fight here.
She put up a really good fight.
And then if you go down this little path down to the bottom, at the bottom of the hill is where we started finding blood drops and clumps of hair that were pulled out.
Kathy said, that she would not go down easy. And so, and based on everything that I knew about her, she was a fighter.
Kathy's death was brutal.
And basically, she was fighting for her life.
She had suffered a powerful blow to the head. Her skull was fractured. She had 3 broken ribs. This was a fight that did not go down fast.
Starting in this area, we started to see some blood drops and some pieces of hair and clumps of hair on the ground. And right down here on that bush here was a sundress. Just a little bit past that is a spot where you look over the edge and her body was visible from up here. So when you stand here looking down, you can see it pretty easily. Just like the others weren't in any way. There was no attempt to hide the bodies in either of the other 2. They were just disposed of in those locations.
What detectives didn't know at the time was that Kathy's determination to live would provide vital evidence. But not for decades later, and then only after solving a mystery like no other.
She collected DNA by scratching, fighting, kicking, whatever. She got his DNA embedded under her fingernails enough that it was viable 28, 9 years later, that they could still get a sample from that.
Fingernail clippings, that was routine in an autopsy. So it wasn't anything special that was done in that particular case because that was routine and done in every case. Just those little things like that back in 1990 didn't mean as much as they do today.
The investigation was passed between officers whose service spanned decades. Breakthroughs proved elusive, but everyone was sure they were looking for a man.
Everybody believed that those murders were committed by the same person.
Uncovering the killer's mistake, the one which would lead to his arrest, was destined never to be easy. When the murders began, policing was in a different age.
We had no computers, so our information would come in from the street. You would try to contact working prostitutes, try to get information from them. You have to establish a priority, for one thing. You could be chasing tips forever, so you just try to follow through with the information and see where it leads you. I think serial killing homicide investigation is a very uneven platform. One day you're up really high, you think you've really come across something, the lead, fails, and boom, down you go. And so it's just a kind of a roller coaster.
The DNA taken from under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe did not match that of any on a federal database. This was before any nationwide database of DNA had even been considered, but detectives tried everything they knew.
You try to get into his mind as much as you can, but it's a guessing game. You try to take a look at the evidence that you've recovered, what the lab may have found out, fingerprints, you follow up on any of that. And I believe we worked on that probably a year on and off, worked on it as much as we could.
They talked to every possible witness. They had something like 600 or 700 different leads. But they were very careful in collecting this evidence and talking to as many people as they could.
This case became cold probably in 91, 92. And, there's other cases out there, other homicides that you're working, other long involved investigations. So it goes cold, but it's not forgotten. So you're always hoping that something is going to, come forward that's going to help somebody at this point in an old case.
Over the 20-year investigation, detectives came across a man who had lived in Spokane around the time of the killings. His name, Douglas Perry. He appeared to be a friend to the sex workers of East Sprague Avenue. He would take them to his home, cook them meals. He talked about getting them off the streets. One of the troubled women Doug befriended on the streets of Spokane became his girlfriend.
Claire Ann, who was a prostitute and hooked on cocaine, and Doug was trying to get her out of that life. Was trying to get her, so he could marry her, so he had this shot at the white picket fence. Storybook ending.
Doug Perry's intentions were not entirely pure.
He seems fixated on prostitutes. He stalks them, he befriends them, he makes use of their services. Clearly, Doug is obsessed with prostitutes, but he has a complicated relationship with them.
Perry was living in Seattle at the time of the murders of Kathy, Yolanda, and Nikki Lowe. Obsessive about sex workers, he was dating one who he wanted to, in his eyes, save from the streets. But he was not on the police radar because nobody other than the girls themselves and Douglas knew. He had never been recorded as a suspect. He had not made a killer's mistake, or so he thought.
This is the portrait of a killer, obsessed with two things: guns and prostitutes. And the intersection of those two things will turn him into a serial killer.
Douglas Perry had a complicated life, whichever way you look at it. He might claim to care about the sex workers of East Sprague Avenue, but in fact, he had a much greater passion in life: guns, which investigators would one day discover.
He really seemed to have an affinity to guns. He loved them a lot because every time he was arrested and a search warrant was done in his house, there were dozens of firearms.
Brian Harris spent decades as a murder squad detective in Houston, Texas. He'd been analyzing the reports made by Spokane police.
They describe how he refers to weapons almost as you would a child, very affectionate and passionate when talking about weapons, not just about the parts, but almost as if it's a lover. When he describes a firearm, it's almost as if it's taken on a human characteristics and he's in love with the actual weapon itself.
Just where did the twin obsession of Douglas Perry, guns and prostitutes, come from? His was an extremely troubled childhood.
Doug Perry was living as a child in an orchard in Omak, Washington, which is kind of this north-central part of the state of Washington. It's rural, predominantly farming, ranching communities. And his family had an orchard, so he was raised on that orchard. Father, mother, older brother, and I think 2 sisters.
It was far from a storybook childhood. Douglas's father had sexually abused him. His mother wasn't much of a parent.
So that certainly would be problematic, picked on in the family and abused in, I think, emotionally, sexually, and physically, beat up.
And then there were the guns. His father was a military weapons expert who would encourage the teenage Doug Perry to practice his shooting.
He would take Doug out target shooting, and those were happy memories for Doug. They may have begun his lifelong obsession with guns.
Perfecting his skill with a rifle became an obsession for Perry Jr. It was his only connection with his father, but the young Douglas Perry was simply not destined to have it easy.
When Doug was 16 years old, his father suddenly died from a burst blood vessel. And Douglas's mother, who would have been the primary caretaker, really wasn't there for him. She had some problems of her own. She wound up institutionalized for severe schizophrenia. So Douglas was pretty much on his own from a young age.
It's perhaps no surprise that Douglas Perry grew to become an odd, aggressively hostile man, close to nobody and known to the police.
Doug's criminal history starts pretty early on. We know at least starts in his 20s. He is arrested on a series of assault charges and weapons violations.
Douglas Perry had been in and out of the system since the 1970s. Crime after crime after crime, yet he'd serve his little bit of sentence and he'd get out. He'd serve his little bit of sentence and get out. And it can be very frustrating in general for society and law enforcement when they see that kind of activity.
When 36, Perry's criminal history hit a new milestone.
In 1988, Doug gets his first felony weapons charges.
Douglas had progressed from guns he might use for shooting practice as a young man to something a whole lot more serious.
I believe what he was doing was making some type of a homemade explosive. And so he got busted.
Police found a massive weapons cache, 5 pipe bombs, 49 guns, 20,000 rounds of ammunition, all in his house.
Now, from this point on, Doug is no longer allowed to legally own guns, which is a big problem for someone as gun-obsessed as Doug is.
2 years before the triple murders by the river in Spokane, Doug Perry had served time for illegal ownership of weapons, but his DNA was not taken. It was an era before such routines were followed.
We did not have DNA in 1990. So you always collect your evidence the same way. And I believe that's what helped in this case. DNA eventually was able to be obtained from that evidence that was collected.
It had been Perry's social worker who tipped police off in 1994 about his stash of deadly weapons. The social workers were also aware of something else. Perry appeared to be a misogynist.
He didn't like women. He found them disgusting and vile. At least the women that were involved in the sex trade, that were prostitutes. He viewed them as pond scum.
Doug's hatred of women was based on a view he would soon voice in prison.
From 1995 to 1997, Douglas Perry spends time in prison on that weapons violation. During his stay, he reportedly tells a fellow inmate that he has killed around 9 prostitutes because he hated them.
He viewed women as baby-making machines. Their purpose on this earth was to create life, to carry babies. And when he would look at these prostitutes, these streetwalkers, he looked at them with disgust.
The conversation with a cellmate wasn't reported for over 15 years, but it would later give detectives a crucial insight into his bitter, hateful mind, and it would allow prosecutors to paint him as a man with a strong motive to kill. Within months of his release from prison, Spokane cops did find out how often Perry spent time with sex workers and the other obsession in his life, weapons.
In 1998, a year after Douglas gets out of prison, he picks up a prostitute and brings her to his home.
And she was really creeped out about the weapons, all the weapons around, and how he was saying he wasn't going to hurt her because he liked her.
She sees knives, she sees guns, she sees crossbows. It freaks her out.
And so when he took her back downtown to the street corner, she flagged down the first cop, she said, and said, "I want to tell you about this weird date that I just had."
While she's talking to police, Douglas Perry drives by, and police pull him over.
Once again, Douglas Perry's obsessions with guns, knives, and prostitutes have threatened to expose him for who he really was.
He's stopped by the Spokane Police Department, and inside of his vehicle, there is writings about his mental health, and it's from mental health workers about his disdain and disgust for women.
They also find in that car some other papers describing the steps to take to get gender reassignment surgery.
Detectives thought no more about this unusual discovery, but because Perry's arms cachet was found, he was sent to jail. It seems remarkable today, but still Douglas Perry's DNA was not taken. While in prison, Doug made a decision that he hoped would change his life.
10 years after Yolanda and Nikki and Kathy were murdered, Douglas Perry takes a trip. Douglas Perry flies to Bangkok, Thailand, and has gender reassignment surgery.
It's in Thailand that Douglas Perry becomes Donna Perry.
The effect of the gender realignment treatment around the year 2000 made life even more difficult for investigating detectives in the triple murder of 1990. By then, it was a cold case. DNA techniques had not helped find a match for traces found under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe, and there had been plenty of other murders between then and now to keep detectives occupied. By becoming Donna, Douglas Perry had put himself further away from the investigative radar screen of Spokane police. The 1990 murder of the 3 prostitutes in Spokane, Washington, remained unsolved in 2004, when original detective Jim Hansen retired.
Well, this case became cold probably in 91, 92. The work that we did at the time was all we could have done. But you're always living with it.
They worked really hard in 1990 on this, and they just ran out of people.
I left the sheriff's office. I retired from the sheriff's office in 1996, and it was still unsolved at that point. It goes cold, but it's not forgotten.
In 2004, I took over cases, and one of those cases was the Kathy Brisboe case.
By then, new investigative tools had become available.
As the years go by, DNA technology advances. So detectives on these cold case squads are resubmitting evidence in hopes of getting a break in these old cold cases.
It was first assigned in 2004 because improvements had been made in DNA processing, and it had become so much more sensitive that there may be some items that now could be tested for DNA and get results where, 10 years prior, there was no way that they would have been submitted.
And among the evidence that detectives submit to a lab in Marysville, Washington for retesting are fingernail clippings from Kathy Brisboe.
It took a while. There was a massive backlog of work. Errors were made. But the results of the test were telling.
Well, in 2009, not 6 months after the case was sent to the Marysville lab, I got a call from one of the scientists that asked me to sit down, which I always love when you get a call that says, "Are you sitting down?" Because it never seems to mean bad news what I was doing. So I said, "Oh yeah." She said that she developed a full male nuclear profile from under the left middle finger of Kathy Brisboe. And therefore, that then is a huge lead.
Almost 20 years after Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe, and Kathy Brisboe had been brutally murdered, it seemed like the breakthrough that cops had waited for had arrived. They'd always thought the killer was a man. Might there be a match on the newly established system?
It's entered in a combined DNA indexing system, one of which is in the state of Washington, the other one is a national database. And then it's routinely run every time somebody's DNA is entered. But if you've been convicted of a felony in the state of Washington, then your DNA is taken as ordered by the court. So it's run against all of those continuously, every day.
The problem is they run it through the database and it doesn't match up with anyone.
Douglas Perry had been arrested several times, but never had DNA taken. The DNA taken from under Kathy Brisbo's fingernail didn't match any of the convicted felons on the national system. But Jim Dresbach and his colleagues on the cold case squad weren't giving up.
Once we got a full male profile, it was just a matter of time. That's going to be resolved one way or the other.
Eventually, Dresbach figured the killer would commit another crime. He just had to wait for the man who claimed the lives of Kathy, Yolanda, and Nikki to make a mistake, which Donna Perry did.
Donna Perry may have changed her outer being, still didn't change who she was on the inside, that fascination with firearms. So Donna Perry gets arrested on, yet again, another federal firearms charge.
It happens in Spokane Valley, just outside the city of Spokane, in March of 2012. Donna Perry is spotted at a White Elephant store there. She's buying ammunition and a pistol magazine, a clip for a gun. And the retired detective sees her and knows that this is a felon and is not allowed to legally own firearms. So Donna Perry is arrested. And this arrest will change everything.
She ultimately ended up pleading guilty, and she had to be brought back to Spokane for that court hearing.
As a convicted felon, Donna Perry is now required to submit a DNA sample to be entered into the national database of convicted felons.
But now it's 2012. DNA has really come to the forefront. And there's a federal requirement, as well as many states, that once you're incarcerated, you have to provide a sample of your DNA. You see, Donna Perry thought she could change her outer look, but the way she is molecularly designed on the inside, that will never change.
A lab technician in Washington State gets a hit.
The detectives in Spokane are notified that there is now a DNA link.
Donna Perry's DNA sample is a direct match to the DNA profile found under the fingernail of Kathy Brisbo. This is huge, but there's a twist. That DNA profile was that of a male. Just who is Donna Perry? What kind of secrets has she been hiding? So now detectives have to start putting together the pieces to figure out how this could be.
They visit Donna Perry, the woman arrested for a gun crime who appeared to have the DNA of the man they had been looking for, the one who had left behind his DNA under the fingernails of Kathy Brisbo's.
All we got to do is we got to get together with her and get a sample, which is a buccal swab, which amounts to swabbing, between the cheek and gum with essentially a Q-tip, putting it in a box and shipping it off and waiting for them to come back and say, yep, it's a match, or no, it's not.
In the meantime, police wasted no time in finding out more about Donna Perry and the man she once been, Doug Perry.
Who is Doug Perry? Where did Doug Perry come from? Where did Doug Perry live? Who were the neighbors? Who were the friends? Who were, what was his family like? The history, what kind of vehicles did he drive was a big deal, because we believed that to one degree or another, and I think every degree really, all three of these victims were transported in one fashion or another to the scene where they ended up.
Inside the house, they find a dozen guns and 12,000 rounds of ammunition. But that's not all they find. One of the agents notices that the closet door is painted shut. So they pry open the door. They think maybe there are more guns in there. But instead, they find something else, really strange. They find several boxes filled with women's underwear, too small for Perry to wear. They're frilly and they're lacy and they look old. And it strikes this ATF agent as being really bizarre. He's a seasoned cop, and to him, these look like the sorts of trophies that serial killers keep to sort of relive the crime.
Donna Perry's DNA came back as a confirmed match for the profile taken from the DNA found under Kathy Brisbo's fingernails.
You've identified a suspect, so now you start working on the suspect. You do, your backgrounds. You try to figure out where the suspect was. You've got a whole list of things to do reference that suspect. You've got to be able to put the suspect back in Spokane at the time of the homicides. You've got to run down vehicles that the suspect may have had, residences. There's just a lot of things to go, and then you've got to be able to tie each homicide to the suspect. So you're going through all the evidence. You're resubmitting evidence for fingerprint comparisons, and all that takes time.
When investigators re-examined evidence from the 3 crime scenes, the case against Perry kept stacking up.
They had the evidence matching Perry to Kathy Brisbo. Now they need more evidence to link to the other victims.
Nikki Lowe had Perry's fingerprint on one of the items that belonged to her. It was in a dumpster, I don't know, a mile, 2 miles away from where her body was recovered. Then Yolanda Sapp had a couple of blankets that were deposited with a body.
And I believe there was DNA of Perry's on the blanket that was found. So that ties those two together.
All of it matches Perry.
Armed with so much evidence, detectives finally get the chance to sit down face to face with their suspect. Would Donna Perry admit to the crimes that Douglas Perry had committed all those years ago?
She was in the room by herself. And so then I just waited for a little bit. Then I went back in with this.
Hey.
And I read it to her.
Hey, Donna, Perry, I heard that.
And when I read that the charge was murder, she said, "Murder? Murder? Who am I supposed to have murder?"
Am I being accused of murder or something?
Yes, you are the prime suspect.
What does this relate to?
Not just one murder, but several.
You're accusing me of murder. Of who?
It was an unusual case, to be sure. A woman denying having been the man who had killed 3 sex workers. Would detectives convince Donna Perry to confess? Under interrogation, Donna Perry admitted that she, as Doug, paid for the services of prostitutes, but denied causing them any harm.
No, I, as a male human being, I did pick up prostitutes, yes. But when I always let them out, alive and well when I let them out.
It's clear that she is going to distance herself from that. She knows nothing about it. I don't know who killed these women. I've never seen these women, she says. I'm not going to admit to killing anyone because I haven't.
How many times would you say you dated a prostitute other than Claire Ann?
Not very many, a couple, 2 or 3 times. Maybe I didn't have the money. But Social Security at that time was only what? Just a little over $700.
Did you ever take any of these prostitutes home to have sex with them?
No.
Was that normal for you? Or?
No.
I got individual photographs of 13 women, all of whom were were hookers back in 1990. Knowing that Perry associated with them, some of them, he was using hookers himself back in those days.
I've got some photographs here I'd like to show you that may help refresh your memory. And the reason why I want to show you these photographs is I know in the 90s you dated some prostitutes.
And the purpose was quite simple, really, when it came right down to it, was to show him these photographs, these photographs one at a time, and have her declare, do you know this person? Have you ever seen him? If she knows the person, how do you know him? You know, how close were, we'd explore each of those. In this case, every single one, she said, nope, never seen him.
Do you know that person?
No.
And this is number 2.
Oh, God, no. No, I didn't date black girls.
Including the victims that were randomly spread out. I just put them up there. Ever seen this person? Nope, never seen him. Never seen him, never seen him. Until I showed him Yolanda Sapp, and then he said, no, she's black. I would never have anything to do with a black person. The question, obviously, is if you have never had any contact with any of these victims, how does your DNA get on?
Even when presented with all the forensic evidence, Donna had an explanation. She knew the murdered girls.
They ran the DNA, full male profile DNA that was found on the subject. Okay. And that came back, when they ran it in CODIS, it came back as a match.
It wouldn't surprise me if you found fingerprints and stuff on them. So I would have sex with them, release them, go home.
Donna refused to admit that she'd killed Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe, and Kathy Brisboes, but her denial came with a twist that detectives weren't expecting.
I killed anybody. I didn't. Donna has killed nobody. I don't know if Doug did or not. It's 20 years ago, and I have no idea whether he did or didn't. You know, if you have proof that I murdered, I can't remember.
Donna was accusing Douglas Perry of the murders. It was an outlandish defense, but would it get Donna off the hook?
Donna versus Doug. Donna didn't do it, but Douglas did, and so you can't convict me because I'm Donna. Douglas did it.
Could detectives find a line of questioning that would draw out an admission of guilt?
People that kill people, multiple people over periods of time, they generally keep going once it starts.
Yeah.
So the question to me as a law enforcement officer to study this in depth, what made Donna stop?
This is a clever interview trick because cops say that when you ask that kind of a question, you can sometimes get the killer to admit to the killings, or you can find out that the killer never did stop, and maybe there are other murders that they didn't know about.
Perry's answer was revealing.
So then I asked myself,
Douglas didn't stop. Donna stopped it. The gender change operation, I have not doubt. I'm convinced of it.
Donna Perry gets upset and she blurts out, Doug didn't stop it. Donna did. Boom. Huge. That was a confession.
Donna insisted that the sex change operation had brought about a huge transformation.
Donna Perry claims that one of the reasons why she had that sex change operation was that she felt that if she had her genitals taken away as a man and got rid of that portion of her life, then she wouldn't be as violent. She wouldn't have that desire anymore to kill.
I got rid of the violence, sex change operation. I'm looking at the emotional.
here's what I'm wondering too. Is
There's no more testosterone to fuel the anger.
So you think that changing from Doug to Donna stopped your anger? And
I'm as paranoid as hell and emotional as hell, but I won't hurt anybody.
She believed that her gender reassignment surgery drew a curtain, and nothing before that occasion, she wasn't responsible. That was somebody else's doing.
Should Donna really be held accountable for Doug's actions?
When I first heard is that, Donna's gonna say Doug did it, and Doug's gonna say Donna did it, and we're gonna get in a big brouhaha in court as to, they're gonna fight back and forth, and it's not really gonna go anywhere.
Can somebody who identified themselves at one point in their life as a man now identify themselves as a woman and say, I'm changed, I haven't done those activities, and that's not me. Douglas Perry is dead.
You didn't get rid of what Doug did before the sex change. That remains.
No,
Maybe
but
nothing else of him remains, but that does.
And you're going to punish Donna. Is that it?
Yes, the body is accountable.
Body is being the same thing.
This would continue to be Donna Perry's defense throughout her trial. But if she thought it would get her off scot-free, she was wrong.
Donna Perry claims that when a person goes from being male to being female, There's a great downturn in violence. Experts say that just isn't true. In closing arguments, one of the prosecutors said, she gelded herself like you would a farm animal.
Prosecutors called upon the testimony of Doug's cellmate, who claimed he confessed to 9 murders back in 1998. But the most damning evidence against him proved to be the DNA collected by Kathy Brisboe. DNA, which might not have been matched but for the mistake that Donna Perry made of being caught in a shop with guns. It was a mistake that led to a DNA swab being taken and the link being made to that found under the fingernails of Kathy Brisboe's.
This is a case of the specific DNA being able to give us a suspect, and in this case, the actual killer, where fingerprints and other things probably would have failed. So when the DNA is developed to the point where it's as sensitive as it is, then we have a suspect that we would not have found. Never would have found him without it.
You know, you pick up a piece of evidence, you say to yourself, you better mark this, you better do it the right way, because somewhere down the line there's going to be a defense attorney that's going to take a look at that and question you about everything you did with that piece of evidence. So hearing about it was great. I just felt that that was going to happen. So it's hard to argue with DNA evidence.
Without the DNA, Perry would certainly be free, yeah.
Perry was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and given 3 life sentences without parole.
You kill somebody, you're going to get caught. And I don't care if you go to the extent of changing your sex by surgery or not, or color your face or cut your hair, you're going to get caught.
Doug Perry could have gotten away with murder. For 22 years, the police had no more leads to follow. But despite becoming Donna, she couldn't leave her old self behind. Her obsession with weapons led to another felony conviction. And when a DNA swab was taken, it gave cold case detectives the breakthrough that they'd been waiting for. That was the killer's mistake, and ultimately Donna's downfall.